So we're moving into video 2, part 2, and thinking about the basics in Greek civilization, right? So the classical era we finished up in that last slide, and we sort of did a broad overview of what all that included. Again, certainly the classical era period of warfare, great development in art and architecture, theater, and philosophy. One of the other elements to consider is, again, we mentioned that classical era is one of great art, and also the one where a lot of our stories relate to the heroic, whether it's from Homer, which was a little earlier, or from the great Olympic athletes, or from the plays. Even the some of the philosophy of Plato talks about being the best you can be, being especially philosophically going after the good, the great virtue of the good, right? The example we have here is Hercules. Hercules is sort of larger than life, stronger than strong, and is again a great example of the heroic for the Greeks. So the Greeks trying to achieve a certain excellence in all that they are, whether it's physical, philosophical, ethical, etc. In the modern tradition, this is exampled by our film, The 300, that indicates or shows Leonidas, who is the great leader of the Spartans, who gives everything, gives his all to defend Greece against this invasion. He, as a Spartan king, is depicted as a descendant of Hercules, so he himself is heroic and lives up that ideal. This is a nice representation of the Theater of Dionysus that is there at the base of the Parthenon. And the Theater of Dionysus represents how some of these dramas about the heroic, but also comedies, were played out for an audience. So the Greeks, very innovative in their architecture, in their art, in their theater, in their ideals. And this is one of the reasons that they are one of the great influencers, if you will. One of the great gifts they give us is our own culture and some of the things that we value as well today. Finally, moving into our great chronology, we talked about the Archaic period, the Classical period. We will also talk a little bit about the Hellenistic era. And the Hellenistic era is this period from about 350 BC to 31 BC. It's a period dominated by Alexander the Great and his legacy. Alexander, a king out of Macedonia, a northern part of Greece, comes to dominate the Greek city-states, but then also comes to invade Persia using this Greek military technology that he and his father have innovated and improved upon. And they will move into Asia and take Greek culture all over the Persian Empire. One of the things that he will do is lay the foundations for a city called, after himself, Alexandria, in Egypt. Alexander will take over Egypt as well. So now we are back into these original places where we first started, right, in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And we have one power controlling all of them. So all of those ideas, all of that technology are all going to come together. So Greek, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and then Persian, which we haven't really gotten into, all of these things are going to come together, and we'll see that in Alexandria. We have Cleopatra the Seventh as our endpoint, because when she dies in 31 BC, it is the Romans who take over and continue that legacy. Just as we started in other civilizations with writing, we want to start with writing in the Greek world as well. Early Greek writing was indeed picture writing, just like the Mesopotamians' cuneiform and the Egyptians' hieroglyphics. And over time, that will change. So we start up with this picture writing that you can see here, just as we've had before. What's going to happen for the Greeks, as you remember your video on writing, the Greeks will come into contact with the Phoenicians, that Semitic people, who come up with symbols that represent sounds. And when the Greeks do this, they will adapt that alphabet to suit their own needs. And so the Greek alphabet that you know today, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc., comes here, and it is a sort of adoption and adaptation of Phoenician writing technology to suit Greek purposes. That's going to be very important. Another technology that the Greeks are famous for is their pottery. And pottery in and of itself is just a utilitarian thing, but with the Greeks they turn it into art, and they have various shapes that certainly are functional, but also come to represent what we think of as sort of classical shapes. The other reason I like this particular pot is because it also shows another craft, weaving. Um, Working on textiles, right? Techne is a Greek word, which is again gives us our root for technology. And here you can see the various stages of weaving. So just as in our other civilizations, basic technology develops as these Greeks develop as well. But perhaps one of the things we really need to focus in on here is the Greek way of thinking, the Greek way of thinking with regard to the world around them, the natural world around them. And that is the difference, perhaps, in the Greek tradition from others that we've seen so far. Aristotle will talk about these pre-Socratics, these first thinkers, as physiologoi, or we might say physicists. And it's not necessarily physicists of today, but people who are interested in the physical world, not the theological world. So not the realm of the spirit realm so much as the realm of the world around us. Yeah. So trees, mountains, landscapes, water. The physical or natural philosophers sought natural explanations for the phenomena that they saw. So they're not looking for supernatural explanations for wind, rain, earthquakes, etc. Right? Take a look at the video presentation at Blackboard under Pre-Socratics. When you finish this PowerPoint, it'll go into a little more detail. So if you look at your McClellan and Dorn, if you look at your videos, etc., you'll find that the pre-Socratics hope to measure the earth. So the word geometry, geo, earth, metry, to measure. So even the discipline, the mathematical discipline of geometry is earth measure, right? They hope to discern the elemental matters, the things that are there in society that are basic. And so you'll see in McClellan and Dorn, they'll talk about the idea of earth and water, air and fire, that there's somehow, these are major forces, these are major elements, and that the earth and all that's around us is somehow made up all of these things. Yes, certainly there are some things they're going to get wrong, but they start to first try to figure out the basics, right? What's the earth made out of? That leads us to a group of Greek philosophers who are atomists. For the first time, we get philosophers saying matter in the world, materials in the world are made of really small things that we can't necessarily see. So now we're getting into abstract thinking, right? We also are going to have astronomers come forward and try to think about what are the heavens made of? If we're trying to figure out what the earth is made of, what are the heavens made of? This is a time period when we get into this era of the pre-Socratics and this era of the archaic age of Greece. Instead of just looking at Greece alone, we should take a moment to sort of step back and see what else is going on. Often called the axial age, when axioms were determined, right? Where basic thoughts, axioms are basic facts, things that you just can't dispute, are determined. And this period seems to go across several centuries, but it also seems to go across several societies. We see new ways of thinking are showing up in Persia, India, China, and Greece, the Greco-Roman world. And it's in religion and philosophy. This offers a striking parallel development in all of these places without any obvious direct cultural contact between all of these participating cultures. So at the same time, all over the globe, people are starting to sit down and ask these questions. It's the Greeks who seem to do it most persistently and effectively, and their ideas seem to survive beyond their own culture, beyond their own time. So we get the Greek pre-Socratics at this time. We also at the same time get Confucius in China, who's trying to figure out how do we live together, what's the philosophy of creating a good state. Buddha in India, trying to figure out the nature of reality. Zoroaster in Persia, another great philosopher. The Hebrews in Babylon, putting together their Bible in the same time period. revising it, editing it, putting it in the order that you know it today. So lots of philosophical inquiry going on at the same time that the pre-Socratics are busy. Right, so lots going on. Some suggest it's because civilization's finally gotten to a level where you can support a philosophical class, where you can support religious and philosophical leaders, and now individual scientists, if we can even call them that in Greece. You have people who have a way to actually have the leisure to sort of stop, sit, inquire, think, and then I'll write it all down. Yeah. So Greek philosophers in this axial age are asking questions that maybe other philosophers around the world aren't asking, but the Greeks are asking them. So where does everything come from? What's the origin of stuff, of things in the material world? From what is everything created? From what is everything created? How do we explain the plurality of things found in nature? When they say plurality, they're thinking of balance, earth, water, but they're also thinking of forces that seem to act upon each other. You throw a ball up in the air, the ball comes straight back down, right? So why are there things that seem to be acting upon each other? What might we describe nature mathematically? And this is an interesting approach, right? The idea of trying to use math to explain the world around us. We've seen some of that in Mesopotamia and Egypt, primarily with measuring fields and such, right? But how do we describe the origin of things mathematically? How do we describe the plurality of things mathematically? So what kind of methods did the pre-Socratics work, or how did they work? Well, they typically worked alone, and that is one of the things that sets them apart from Mesopotamia and Egypt early on, is that they're working alone. Now, some founded their own schools, and you'll hear about Aristotle's Lyceum, Plato's Academy. Pythagoras had his own school, but we really shouldn't think of them as schools like modern schools today. What we should think of them is groups. Some might even say cults, because some of these groups were very secretive. But again, typically worked alone. Sometimes these individuals had students, and they followed them in a school. There is no state patronage, as we noted earlier. So there's not in Greece the ability to call upon state research funds, right? That's not happening at all. These various thinkers may have met, they may have discussed ideas, but we have very little evidence of this. When we see the scientific revolution in Europe, we're going to note that this idea of sharing and exchanging of ideas was critical, right? But still, we're not sure in the with pre-Socratics in the Archaic era if that actually happened. So let's talk about some examples of these thinkers. Thales, again, your book is going to go through a large number of examples. We won't have time to go through all of them here. There's plenty of examples there. And we have examples at Blackboard as well, so please do take a look. But Thales, for him, the only constant is change, right? He is someone who thinks that, if you're looking for the origin of things, if you're looking for how things were created, he says, there's a lot going on in the world. And in particular, he and other philosophers said, if you take a river and you step into a river, you're going to change the riverbed, and the river's going to change the way it flows just a little bit. So he's one of the great thinkers that you can never step in the same river twice, right? So the only constant, he says, is change. Pythagoras, again, your book will talk a lot about Pythagoras and his introduction of mathematics. And we have Pythagoras shows up in your video, The Story of One. So please make sure you take a look at that if you haven't already. Pythagoras is going to introduce mathematics into natural philosophy. Can we use mathematics to argue for what the source of the world is, for how forces in the world work on each other? Democritus, as we noted earlier, he's the fellow who comes up with this idea that all matter is made of atoms. Again, we pretty much take that for granted today, but in his day that was an extraordinary claim. One of the other periods, one of the other fellows coming out of this period, one of the pre-Socratics, is Hippocrates, and we mention him because, as McClellan and Dorn note, he may not be a pure scientist, right? He may be someone who applies science. So, are doctors scientists or are they technologists, right? And so Hippocrates, he's a very interesting fellow, father of medicine, if you will, founder of Western medicine, and doctors today who graduate from med school will most likely still take the Hippocratic Oath, which starts off first, do no harm. He's around in the 400s BC. Again, we suggested the father of medicine. And like all the other pre-Socratics, he's looking for causes in ailments outside the realm of the gods. He argued that if the gods inflicted illness upon humans, how could he, a human medicinal specialist, ease the affliction, right, if he is below the gods? So I always thought that was a very interesting point for him to make. And so he's an interesting fellow because he also keeps very detailed records of his patients who came in. He wrote them down. He compared the data that he collected from patient to patient. He was very much interested in head trauma, in brain injury, and on occasion had the opportunity to actually inspect the brain. Sometimes he had such significant cranial problems, right, that he was able to actually operate. Many of his patients survived. So he has very detailed records. He offers clinical accounts of each of his patients. And so, again, very early on, through observation, through analysis, through comparison, we get this scientific approach to the human condition, to medicine. He very famously diagnosed epilepsy. In his day, people who suffered from epilepsy were thought to be possessed, that somehow the gods were trying to inform them of something, were somehow trying to work through them. And so Hippocrates is the first to say, no, this is just a condition, it's a neurological condition. And he's the first to try to treat epilepsy as an actual disease. So Hippocrates. Moving on to our fellow Aristotle. Aristotle takes up a lot of time for McClellan and Dorn, and for good reason. He's one of the great thinkers of the classical era, but he is a Socratic, right? He is not one of our earlier fellows, pre-Socratic, but a Socratic, and he writes about just so many things. So he comes together and influences, his writings have influenced history for a very long time. But let's just take a look at some of the things he writes about. He writes about logic and the use of logic for understanding problems. He writes about cosmology, does work on cosmology. What's the relationship of the Earth to the other planets? Psychology, human behavior, natural history. Again, what's the history of the Earth? What about plants? What about animals in the world? How do we classify them? He's the first to classify various species. Anatomy, human anatomy, very interested in human anatomy. We don't know exactly how much of human anatomy he was able to learn about through cadavers. We don't know for sure, but he very much interested in that. Metaphysics. Metaphysics essentially trying to understand what is there in the world and what is it like? What is it made of, right? So trying to understand the natural world around him. Also very much engaged in ethics, right? So Aristotle also developing ideas about ethics. You may know that he writes about comedy, he writes about drama, he writes about literature. So Aristotle seems to be interested in almost all aspects of human nature and the nature of the world around him. McClellan and Dorn are interested, as you know, in their book Science and Technology, and quoting Aristotle, they show that Aristotle is studying the Greeks around him as well, and the Greeks' approach to science, and he's one of the first to do this, and that's why it's so significant to quote. And they're quoting him saying, and this is Aristotle, when everything practical had already been provided, Those sciences were discovered which deal neither with the necessities nor with the enjoyment of life, and this took place earliest where men had leisure. They were pursuing science for the sake of knowledge itself, and not for utilitarian applications. And this is one of the things that sets the Greeks apart. Right, this is what sets the Greeks apart. This is also part of that axial age that we were talking about earlier. So let's say that again, when everything practical had already been provided, right? So farming tools, weapons, those sciences were discovered which deal neither with the necessities like water, plants, food, but with the, and not even with the enjoyment of life, like textiles, pottery, wine, beer, and this took place earliest where men had leisure, right? They were pursuing science for the sake of knowledge itself and not for utilitarian applications. So the idea that we don't need to be pursuing science and technology just to get by, just to live, but because we actually have the time on our hands to do this kind of study. We want to talk a little bit about its cosmology, Aristotle's cosmology, because the worldview that he establishes will become the dominant worldview of where's the earth, what's its place in the universe. For him, the earth is spherical. It's round. This idea that the earth is flat is a modern misconception. The ancients knew the earth was round. And again, some of your videos will talk about that. He knew this, or we know that he knew it, because of the shadow that the earth casts on the moon during a lunar eclipse. He would record such things, and this is how he said, oh, well, the earth is round. It's pretty clear to see, because it creates a round shadow when it passes between the sun and the moon. Right? So the earth is stationary. Now, I just said passes, but for him, the earth is stationary. The earth does not move. The earth is in place, right? He says there's common sense for this, because when a ball is thrown straight up, it falls back to its point of origin. If the earth were moving, the ball would somehow fall elsewhere, right? So the earth is stationary, he thought. The earth is round. This image here, and it's a little fancy, sorry, it's a little bright and colorful, but I kind of like it. It shows sort of a drawing of the worldview he had. In your book provides an even better one, but the earth as stable, as in one place, surrounded by some of those elements, right? Air, you see the air, you understand there's air, there's wind above. That he thought was followed by a ring of fire. Which again, very interesting. So energy up here in fire. Beyond that, there's the moon, and the moon, again, in a perfect circle, rotates around the Earth. And then there's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then finally the sun out there as well. He talks about how somewhere out here in this final sphere are these fixed stars, the stars that do not move. Right, so he talks about these being fixed stars. Planets move. Planet in Greek just means wanderer, right? So the planets move. The stars up here are fixed, and somewhere beyond that is something of the divine. So as you can see, this was his ideal, right? The circle is the perfect form. The earth is a sphere, and everything follows that form out there into the heavens. In order for this to work, and McClellan and Dorn give you fuller details on this, in order for this to work, there are certain laws of motion and operation for the Earth, and then there are certain laws of motion and operation for the celestial realm, for things outside the Earth. And Aristotle will make logical arguments for why this is so. So for his system to work, things have to operate differently here on Earth than they do in the heavens. And so as long as you're willing to accept that there's two sets of physical laws, right, then everything sort of works. And with this understanding, Aristotle's worldview becomes one of the most prevalent worldviews, well, for about 2,000 years, right, until we get Copernicus coming along. So thinking of those two sets of rules in the terrestrial realm, the earthly realm is below the orbit of the moon. The four elements, and that's earth, water, air, and fire, seek their so-called natural places. Motion on the earth is up or down. toward or away from the earth. And in the celestial realm, everything is perfection. The circle is the perfect form. Stars are fixed in that final ring. And all of the planets that we see moving around the earth and the sun itself move in perfect circles. And they move in lines or in circular rotation, right, as opposed to up and down as things do on the earth. So the terrestrial has certain laws and the celestial has certain laws. All right, so that's our Aristotle. The next selection we want to move to, and this will wrap up our approach to the Greeks, is this time period in Alexandria in Egypt, the Hellenistic era, the period that comes after Aristotle. It is interesting that Aristotle has a connection to this era because he was the personal tutor of Alexander the Great, this young man out of northern Greece who becomes the king of Macedonia, the leader of the Greeks, and takes over the Persian Empire, all at a very early age. And so Aristotle was his personal tutor. And some suggest that Aristotle inspired Alexander to want to travel broadly and widely and to experience and catalog everything he saw. And Alexander did take, indeed, people along with him on his great trek across Persia, cataloging all the plants and animals that he found. It is one of his successors, a fellow by the name of Ptolemy, who will claim Egypt as his own kingdom, and this will be the same kingdom eventually of Cleopatra. At Alexandria, we've returned back to this idea of state patronage, and the kings of Egypt, we can call them pharaohs, but they're Greeks, and so typically kings and queens of Egypt will support a museum, they'll support a great library, and they'll support scholars to work there. There they will engage in all of the things that we normally consider somehow associated with science. They'll develop mathematics, they'll work on anatomy, remembering that your Egyptians practice mummification, that's still going on, so anatomy is there. We've got a lot of examples. At the museum and the library, they'll study literature, physics, poetry, history, music, engineering, and so forth and so on. So there are so many different disciplines that will be studied at Alexandria. This is our image of Cleopatra. To your left, you have a Roman image of Cleopatra looking very much like a lovely Roman matron. You know her connection to Julius Caesar, to Mark Antony. And on your right, you have her as Pharaoh of Egypt. Here she is as Pharaoh of Egypt. This is her son, named Caesarion. Yes, the child of Julius Caesar. And so you get working in Egypt, just to remind you, these amazingly different cultures coming together: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Mesopotamian. This is back the Greeks in the Fertile Crescent. And you get the Greek math, Greek logic, Greek reasoning and scientific approach combined with the old-fashioned kingly patronizing, kingly financial support that gives you some amazing developments here. This is a modern image of Alexandria today. This is the port here in Egypt. We think that right here in this water, which you can see a little bit through, is where today the museum and maybe Cleopatra's palace is. The Alexandria is right there in the Nile Delta. Waters and land shift over time in delta regions. You only have to go to New Orleans and the Great Mississippi to see changes going on there. And we think that the remains of that great facility are perhaps underwater today. We have other videos at Blackboard that will talk about some of the thinkers at Alexandria. But in particular, as we said before, this royal patronage is going to attract a lot of scholars from around the world. Eratosthenes was the librarian, the head librarian at Alexandria. He was nicknamed Beta because he was second best at everything. He was second best at geography, second best at astronomy, second best at engineering. And he was just a fellow who did an awful lot of work at the library. And we have a selection from one of your videos, one of the TED Talks at this selection talks about how Eratosthenes was able to measure the circumference of the Earth. So take a look at that, please. We also have in this time period Archimedes, again, very much interested in physics and engineering. And Archimedes is an Alexandrian who winds up in Syracuse, and he is another Greek who is interested not only in the theoretical but also the practical applications of science. So please take a look at those there to get a nice chance at him, and also review your McClellan and Dorn on these fellows. So what kind of conclusions can we come to on the Greeks? All these great time periods, all of this great influence. The Greek contribution to science is influential. They're conducting empirical investigation of the natural world. Empirical means evidence gathering, examples, keeping records, jotting things down. As we mentioned with Hippocrates and his case studies in medicine, collecting data, organizing data, analyzing data. So that's the empirical investigation, relying upon evidence, sensory evidence, evidence we experience to make our decisions. They're studying geography, physics, math. They're trying to use rational explanations for phenomena that they see. And then they're going beyond that and trying to come up with theories, trying to come up with ideas about how things came to be, and using abstract thinking, abstract math to get there. Aristotle dominates our thinking in the West for 2,000 years. As we said before, he is the first to put in writing the idea that we should do science for the sake of knowledge. We should inquire just to know. There are certainly practical applications, especially in warfare and in medicine. And in the Middle Ages of Europe, in the Middle Ages, which are coming, that's where we're headed next, Europe will discover the Greeks through their contact with Islam. What does that mean? It means that in the world of Islam, which is coming, right, the scholars of Islam will be very interested in what the Greeks were doing, especially in Aristotle. Your book, McClellan and Dorn, says the Romans aren't so much interested. The Romans like practical applications, but they're not interested a whole lot in Greek theory, and don't advance Greek science and Greek math much. But we'll have to wait for Islam almost 1,000 years. Well, maybe not quite 1,000. Yeah, almost 1,000 years after the Romans control the area. For not only will we perpetuate Greek knowledge, we'll preserve it, we'll perpetuate it, and we'll add to it. So the next step we'll take is moving into the Middle Ages and looking at Christian Europe and Islam and the connection to science and society.